Today's lecture is sponsored by the Edith B. and Arthur E. Early Lectureship. Arthur Early was chairman and chief executive officer of a Cleveland advertising firm, who also served as a trustee of the Cleveland Playhouse, the Cleveland Institute of Music, and the Cleveland Theater Festival, and as a director and officer of the Cleveland Arts Council. Edith Early was a teacher and an active volunteer in Cleveland at many organizations. They were devoted Chautauquans, and I'd ask you to please join me in thanking the Early family for their generosity. Joining us today is journalist, author, and juggler James Geary, the deputy curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, and the author of Wit's End, What Wit Is, How It Works, and Why We Need It, in which he explores every facet of wittiness and how wit is more than simply being funny. Mr. Geary's other books include I Is Another, The Secret Life of Metaphor, and how it shapes the way we see the world, the New York Times bestseller, The World in a Phrase, A Brief History of the Aphorism, and The Body Electric, An Anatomy of the New Bionic Senses. The former editor of the European edition of Time magazine, he has served since 2012 as deputy curator of the Nieman Foundation, where he is an editor of the Nieman Reports, oversees other Nieman print and online publications, and manages a range of duties related to the Nieman Fellowship Program and the Foundation's journalism outreach efforts. Prior to his appointment at Harvard, Mr. Geary lived and worked as a journalist in Europe for 23 years. He is a graduate of Bennington College. We are so honored to host him this week, along with his wife, Linda Hutnick, on their first visit to Chautauqua. His lecture this morning is entitled 5 Ways to be Witty. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to James Geary.
Good morning, Chautauqua. First, may I just thank the Chautauqua Institution for the invitation to my wife and myself to be here. As Jeff said, this is our first time. And just in the past 2 days, I've learned so much that I've had to rewrite significant sections of my speech. I'm less grateful for that, but seriously, folks, it is a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. In just the past 48 hours, I've encountered lots and lots of wit. I've encountered it in the talks that I've gone to and the lectures and the people I've heard, but I've also encountered it in my conversations with you, the Chautauquans, between lectures and before lectures and after lectures. And that's what kind of made me rewrite my speech frantically this morning. One of the lectures I attended was yesterday. It was Rabbi Bob Alper's talk at 2 o'clock in the Hall of Philosophy. And he was talking, if you were there, as it seems many of you were, he was talking about Lifecycle events. And we weren't able to get into the Hall of Philosophy, so we were in that building across the way. And as he started, people were still arriving, and chairs were scuffling across the floor, and people were taking off their raincoats and trying to fold up their umbrellas. And I thought he said, spin cycle events. And coincidentally, we've been having trouble with our washing machine. And I thought, Chautauqua is even better than I thought. Rabbi Bob is about to teach me how to effect home repairs on home appliances. So I thought, this is great. But what he actually said was life cycle events. And those are events like birth, marriage, death, that we tend to commemorate with some kind of ceremony. And he had a really nice catchphrase for that. 3 words, which I can only remember the second 2, so maybe someone here can help me. Okay, just one at a time, ladies and gentlemen. What was it? It was hatch, match, and dispatch. It was hatch that I couldn't remember. And I thought, well, that must be like, cotton, nylon, permanent press on the spin cycle. But Rabbi Bob set me straight, and then I finally did understand what he was talking about. And I got to thinking about life cycle events, and my wife Linda and I last night were talking about it, and things that have happened in our lives and our families, apart from the hatch, match, and dispatch, that sometimes we did commemorate, sometimes inadvertently, and sometimes we didn't commemorate. And it got me thinking about life cycle events that have to do with wit. And I thought about the times when I first received the gift of wit and how I could commemorate that. And I thought of 2 things. First was my parents. My parents were very witty people, and my father had 4 siblings. I'm the youngest of 4 children, and my parents would always organize parties with their siblings. So not only were they family, but they were actually friends. And so all the major holidays we celebrated together, but also just kind of random weekend parties. And my cousins, 2 of my cousins and I, the same age as me, Matt and Steve, we used to sneak downstairs during our parents' parties, and by this time in the evening, they would reach a certain point where enough scotch and soda was being consumed that they wouldn't notice we had snuck out of bed. And we hid under the sofa, and we secretly tape recorded their parties. So the parties involved like people dressing up in old sheets and putting Christmas ornaments in their hair and singing songs and doing skits. And I just wish today, I think back and I wish today that I still had those tapes, because I could blackmail my extended family and be independently wealthy by now. So that's one instance where I felt like I had received the gift of wit from my parents. And I commemorated that, and there's a little anecdote about my father in this book, and an anecdote about my mother in a book on metaphor that I wrote. But the second time that I felt like I had been given the gift of wit was also when I was a very young child. I was 8 years old, and that gift I found in the pages of Reader's Digest magazine. More specifically, the quotable quotes section of Reader's Digest magazine. In my house, when I was growing up, we were not a people of the book, if I can put it that way. There were no books in my house. So I spent most of my time reading the back of the Captain Crunch cereal box. But we did subscribe to 2 magazines, and very strangely, perhaps not so strangely, those 2 magazines ended up having a big impact on my life. The first magazine was Time magazine. We subscribed to Time, and I, as Jeff said during the introduction, I ended up working for Time magazine. And that was a huge part of my career as a journalist. The second magazine was Reader's Digest. And one day, I was in the bathroom, which also served as our library, and I was paging through Reader's Digest. I was 8 years old, and I came to the page called Quotable Quotes. So if you subscribe or have subscribed, or if you've been to the dentist recently, you will know quotable quotes. And quotable quotes typically contained wise sayings from great sages like Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Phil, and things like, if you marry for money, you'll earn every penny. But believe it or not, so what these things are, which I didn't know at the time, I was only 8 years old, these are aphorisms. They're short, witty, philosophical sayings. Now, I was 8. I didn't know an aphorism from a hole in the wall, but I knew there was something special about this use of language. And I still remember the very first aphorism that I read when I was 8. And it goes like this. The difference between a rut and a grave is the depth. Just think about that for a little bit. Again, I was 8 years old. I was not really sure what that meant, but I definitely know what it means now. And in fact, when we think about wit, we tend to think of these aphorisms, these short, witty, philosophical sayings. I just want to share a few of my favorites. Lily Tomlin. All my life, I always wanted to be somebody, but I realize now I should have been more specific. Jean Cocteau, famous French surrealist poet, playwright, painter, and boxing promoter. Mirrors would do well to reflect a little longer before sending back images. Stanislav Lec, a Polish dissident, did his best work in the 1950s and 60s during the era of the Soviet Union in Poland. No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible. And my all-time favorite, this is by a Russian actress named Faina Ranovskaya, and she was active in the 1920s. And she had many fans in Russia, and they would write her letters, and she would write back. And her letters contained these great, great aphorisms. And one of my all-time favorites goes like this. Baldness is the gradual transformation of the head into an ass. It's not even finished yet. First in shape, then in content. So, but what I realized in researching and writing my book about wit is that this kind of verbal wit is only one kind of wit. There's also visual wit, there's physical wit, as well as intellectual wit. There are many, many different kinds of wit, and many kinds of wit don't involve language at all. So my first task in researching wit was to try to define it. And that's how I came up with this gentleman here, Alexander Pope, because I think he has one of the most insightful definitions of wit, and I'll just read it for you. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Now what I like about this definition is that he says true wit is nature to advantage dressed. True wit is natural. Wit is not something that only geniuses or late-night television hosts possess. True wit is something we all possess, but it is to advantage dressed. So it's kind of dressed up. Wit is performative. It's kind of enhanced or embellished. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Again, what oft was thought, wit is not some kind of really exceptional mode of thinking. It's how we all think every day. It's how we all live our lives every day, living by our wits, but ne'er so well expressed. Wit is precise. It's well crafted. There's a certain artistry to a witticism. Now, looking at this definition, there is one thing that is conspicuously absent in the way that we today understand wit. And I just was wondering if any of the Chautauquans here this morning can identify what is missing from this definition of wit that we would think is essential to wit? Well, a minute ago, you were all shouting at the same time. I don't know what happened. What's missing? Humor! Right. So you can imagine my confusion when I was scheduled to appear during the week called What's Funny? Because if there's one takeaway that I would like you to have from my talk, and which is actually the worst possible news for the next 60 minutes, is that wit is not at all about being funny. Wit can be funny, but it doesn't have to be funny. And really, the true meaning of wit has nothing to do with humor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's my presentation today. So I just want to give you an example. Very famous, legendary general, Kunming. He was beloved by his troops because he was such a genius on the battlefield. Never lost a battle. His men adored him. He was in one conflict where he was completely out of ammunition. There were no arrows left in his army's quivers. And the enemy was chasing his army up the Yangtze River, and his army was camped at one point on the river, and the opposing army was camped a little bit further down the river. And the emperor, the Chinese emperor, who was secretly jealous of Kunming because the troops loved him so much more than the emperor himself, he went to Kunming and he said, "Look, we don't have any ammunition. You must get for me 100,000 arrows within 3 days or I will execute you." That's not funny. Kunming, being a good soldier, a loyal soldier, he said, "Yes, Your Majesty, I will get you 100,000 arrows in 3 days or my life will be forfeit." So the first day came and went, and Kunming did nothing. His troops found that a little bit surprising, to be honest, but he had always pulled through before, and so they had a lot of trust and faith in him. So the second day and night came, and Kunming, again, did nothing. He's just kind of sitting in his tent, making little doodles in the sand with a stick. His men were starting to get a little bit nervous, because there was just one day left, and he had to come up with 100,000 arrows from scratch, or he was going to be executed. So, finally, the third day arrives, and again, Kunming does absolutely nothing. Now his men, I think it's fair to say, are freaking out, because they know there's a couple hours left, and they have no arrows, and they need 100,000 arrows. The night of the third day comes, and a thick fog rolls up the Yangtze River. Kunming emerges from his tent, instructs his men to get all the boats that they have, pile them with bales of hay, and throw black cloths over the bales of hay. He then instructs them to tie all the boats together with ropes and lower them down until they're right in front of the opposing army's camp. Now remember, it's pitch dark, a thick fog has rolled up the river. When the boats are in front of the enemy camp, he instructs his men to beat the war drums as if they're about to attack. The opposing army leaps from their tents. They unleash volley after volley into the boats. All the arrows land harmlessly in the bales of hay. When the opposing army has spent all their arrows, Kunming instructs his men to pull the boats back and take the arrows out of the bales of hay. The next morning, Kunming goes to the emperor, and he says, "Emperor, here are your 100,000 arrows. Today we will return them to our enemy." So, that's very witty, in my opinion. It's not necessarily very funny. But what did Kunming do? He wasn't just doing nothing. When he got that assignment from the emperor, he had studied the weather. And he predicted, he guessed, that the fog would arrive on the third night. And that's what he was waiting for. He used his wits to solve a problem when he had no resources and very little to work with. So I think that's an example of being witty without being funny. But this is a week about comedy, so I also want to give you an example of wit that is funny. This is a story about Herschel Osterpoyer, who's an actual historical figure, lived in the late 18th, early 19th century in what is now Ukraine. And he was like one of the figures that are in all world religions, the kind of holy fool. He was a jokester and a trickster, and he was very funny and very charming, but he was joking so much and so constantly that he really couldn't hold down a job. And so the village kind of pulled together and took care of him. And he was often invited to people's homes because otherwise he wouldn't have anything to eat. And so one night he was invited to a dinner party, and he was seated across from a local aristocrat, a very wealthy man, very arrogant man. And Herschel, I guess we could say, didn't have the best table manners, and he was always famished. So at dinner he was stuffing his face with food. And the aristocrat sitting across the table from him was clearly disgusted by Herschel. And he said to Herschel, "What separates you from a pig is what I would like to know." And Herschel said, "The table." So you can see wit can be funny, but it doesn't have to be funny. And what really wit is, in my opinion, is a kind of intelligence. And that brings me to Dorothy Parker, who wrote, "There's a hell of a distance between wisecracking and wit. Wit has truth in it. Wisecracking is simply calisthenics with words." So what's important about that, I think, is it does get at wit has truth. Wit is a form of intelligence. Jokes make you laugh, but wit makes you think. And in fact, the actual meaning of the word wit, it comes from a Sanskrit verb, vid, which means to see. And actually this is where the word video comes from, but it's also the root of the word for wit. And in all cultures around the world, all languages around the world, the verb to see is used as a metaphor to understand. I see what you mean. When I say that, I actually don't see anything, but it's a metaphor to express, yes, I understand you. So wit actually means to see. And it's the same root behind the words witness, which is to see something, and wisdom. Wisdom also comes from that Sanskrit verb to see, to know. So if you're in the bookshop afterwards, and you come across a book, The Wit and Wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, or The Wit and Wisdom of Dorothy Parker, that's actually a redundant title. It might just as well be The Wit and Wit of Dorothy Parker and The Wisdom and Wisdom of Abraham Lincoln. And if you think about the way we use the word wit in everyday language, it's got nothing to do with being funny. Someone is quick-witted, someone is dim-witted, someone is nit-witted. I'm not referring to anyone in particular right now, just speaking generally. What? I don't get that. How we use the phrase, you have to keep your wits about you, you're living by your wits, you're scared out of your wits, you reach your wits' end. So really, for me, I think the essence of wit is more a state of mind than a sense of humor. And with all due respect to Alexander Pope and Dorothy Parker, that leads me to my own definition. Wit is the quick, instinctive intelligence that allows us to think, say, or do the right thing in the right place at the right time. Now, my talk is called 5 Ways to be Witty, and I'm going to share with you those 5 ways. Guaranteed to make you witty, or your money back from the Chautauqua Institution, not from me. And also, I want to work towards the why we need wit, which I think is really important. And one of the reasons why has to do with Denis Diderot, who French philosopher, 18th century philosopher. He's the guy who came up with the idea for the encyclopedia, and he wrote a lot of the encyclopedia himself. He was also at a dinner party, and he was also insulted at a dinner party. But unlike Herschel, he couldn't think of a comeback in the moment. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where something happens, someone is rude to us, someone offends us, and we can't think in the moment what we should say or do. That happened to Denis Diderot, and he came up with a term for it, and he called it l'esprit d'escalier, the wit of the staircase. Because the wit of the staircase is the kind of wit you get only when you're leaving the dinner party, walking downstairs, and you have that faceplant moment, that's what I should have said to that jerk. Now, I don't want anyone to leave here today suffering from the scourge of l'esprit d'escalier. It's also interesting to note that in French, the word for wit is l'esprit, spirit. And I think that has a lot to do with the link between spirituality and wit that many speakers have been addressing this week. So now, without further ado, here are 5 ways to be witty. And the first way is to take things literally. So you think about metaphor, Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun, but actually we use metaphor all the time. Anytime we talk about anything abstract, feelings, emotions, ideas, we have to use metaphor because there's no way to directly express those things. You see metaphors everywhere. In ordinary conversation, I scanned the headlines this morning before coming over here, and there was, of course, lots about the Democratic debate, and it was described as a clash. The candidates were fending off attacks. They were sparring angrily, and the question on everyone's lips was, who won? Those are all metaphors. And metaphors that reveal something, I would argue, rather unfortunate about the way that we think about politics as some kind of battle. Witch hunt, also a very popular metaphor these days. But the thing about metaphor is it's way more pervasive than you think. This is a sentence from the Financial Times, and there are 31 words in this sentence, and I'm just going to read the sentence and just shout out when you hear a metaphor, and we're just going to count them. Are you with me? A solid end to the first quarter on Wall Street. No, that's a metaphor. It's either a metonymy or a synecdoche. One of those is a town in upstate New York, and the other is a kind of a metaphor. Where one thing stands for a whole. Prepared Asian bourses for an upbeat start, but a deluge of mixed data took the wind out of a potential rally. Yes, 31 words, 8 metaphors. So that's how pervasive metaphor is in our lives, and it's not just in poetry. So, one way to be witty is to take metaphors literally. As in this New Yorker cartoon, this guy visiting his doctor, he's got a blade of a knife sticking out of his back, and the doctor says, "Good news, it's a metaphor." So, another person who was great at taking things meant figuratively, literally, was Groucho Marx. So Groucho, he was living in LA in the 1950s, and his son went down to the local local country club swimming pool. But he was not admitted to the country club swimming pool because he was Jewish. And Groucho's son went home, told Groucho what had happened, and Groucho was rightly furious and indignant. And Groucho hatched, matched, and dispatched a telegram to the country club in which he said, "Listen, My son's mother is not a Jew, so can he go in up to his waist since he's only half Jewish? So you see, when you take a metaphor literally, you can make the person who used the metaphor seem ridiculous, which sometimes comes in handy. Second way to be witty is to make a category mistake. And you'll see I am a big Marx Brothers fan. I was going to say the Marx Brothers. A category mistake is just a thing in a kind of philosophy where a thing that belongs in one category is presented or understood as if it belonged in another category. It's a way to kind of debate philosophical errors. And in the clip we're about to see, there are two category mistakes made by Harpo, and I'll just set it up briefly for you. The guy in the middle is Ambassador Trentino, the evil Ambassador Trentino, and he has asked Chico and Harpo to dig up dirt on Groucho. They are posing as private detectives, and they're meant to get incriminating evidence on Groucho, of which there is that kind of evidence in abundance. And so Ambassador Trentino is asking them what they have, if we can play the clip. So Harpo makes two category mistakes. He misunderstands a criminal record for a phonograph record. And then when Trentino throws the record in the air, he mistakes that for a skeet shooting target. So category mistakes are a great way to be witty. And you often see category mistakes in headlines in newspapers. I want to share two actual headlines with you. Include your children when baking cookies. And, you know, some people have a problem with that, but as long as it's gluten-free, I'm okay with it. And this one, another piece of great advice. Never withhold herpes infection from a loved one. I can imagine circumstances in which you would want to withhold a herpes infection from a loved one, but so many aphorisms, like we were talking about earlier, they also work by category mistakes. Josh Billings is a great aphorist. He was a contemporary of Mark Twain, and at that time he was just as famous as Mark Twain. A lot of his aphorisms work by category mistakes, and one in particular, be like a postage stamp. Stick to one thing until you get there. The third way to be witty is to violate benignly expectations. Now, quick, what is that? The Loch Ness Monster? Wrong! Anybody else? A what? A bobcat? A mustache on a bobcat. I am so sorry to disappoint you. It is not the Loch Ness Monster. It is not a mustache. It is three squiggly lines on a white background. So the human brain is a pattern-making machine. And when we are presented with incomplete information, the brain just automatically fills in the gaps. And so the reason we all think that that's the Loch Ness Monster is because we look at it and our brain thinks we can see the body of the Loch Ness Monster continuing under the white, which must be Loch Ness. But it's not actually there. Where that image exists is in your brain. And so, another great way to be witty is to violate the expectations that the human brain naturally has. And a master of that is Chuck Jones. I'm going to show a clip of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, a great, great source of philosophical insight and wit. There are three benign violations in this clip, and we're just going to play the clip. I don't need to set it up because it's silent. It's silent. But just pay attention and we'll review the the benign violations afterwards, if we can roll the clip. Chuck Jones. So there are 3 benign violations, and it's pretty obvious where they are. But what's amazing about that clip is what Chuck Jones does there is that there are 2 benign violations when the roadrunner runs into the painting and the truck comes out of the painting. But the 3rd benign violation, he violates the expectations that he's created in you about that painting by restoring the laws of physics on the 3rd violation. Genius. So, again, I've been really interested in hearing all the talks about humor and laughter and spirituality, and benign violations are how a lot of spiritual teaching stories and parables work. There was an old woman, very poor old woman, lived in a village, and every morning she would stand outside the baker's shop just to smell the delicious smell of the freshly baked bread. She didn't have enough money to actually buy the bread. She just wanted to smell it. And eventually the baker got annoyed by this. And one day he came outside and he said to the woman, "Look, if you're going to be standing outside my shop every single day smelling my bread, you're going to have to pay me." And the woman said, "But I don't have any money. I can't pay you." And then he said, "Well, then you're going to have to stop standing in front of my shop." So it was a small village, crowd gathered round. Some people took the side of the baker, some people took the side of the old woman, and eventually they couldn't come to agreement, so they decided to take the issue to King Solomon. And King Solomon, in his wisdom, heard both sides, and he said to the woman, "Woman, you must pay the baker." And she was shocked and taken aback. And King Solomon said, "How much money do you have?" And she just reached into her pocket and jingled the few pennies that she had. And Solomon turned to the baker and said, "Baker, you have been paid." And the baker said, "What? She hasn't given me any money." And Solomon said, "Didn't you hear the sound of her coins? That's payment for the smell of your bread." The 4th way to be witty is to use Talmudic logic. Now, the Talmud, as many of you probably already know, is a book of Jewish law and Jewish ritual. And what I find so fascinating and compelling about the Talmud is that it's not considered infallible. It's not even considered finished. It's basically an argument taking place over many centuries among a bunch of different rabbis. And unlike the Christian tradition, or the Catholic tradition at least, where the Pope is considered infallible, that's not the case with the Talmud. And what's prized about the Talmud is the argument. And what's valued about the Talmud is the ingenuity and artistry of the argument. And so there's a value placed on being, on thinking things through in kind of original, creative ways. And using Talmudic logic is a really great way to be witty. And this story is another one from Herschel. And again, Herschel, displaying Talmudic logic, was invited to a meal at someone's house. This time it was lunch. And his friend said, "On your way, would you mind picking up 2 loaves of bread for our lunch?" And Herschel said, "I would not mind at all." And he did so. And as you can see here, one loaf was much larger than the other loaf. And when he got to his friend's house, Herschel gave his friend the small loaf, and he kept the larger loaf for himself. And his friend said, "That's rude." And Herschel said, "What do you mean? What would you have done in my position?" And he said, "Well, I would have given you the larger loaf and kept the small one for myself." And Herschel said, "But you got the small one. What are you complaining about?" So that's Talmudic logic. The logic is impeccable. It may or may not have anything to do with the situation at hand, but the logic is incredibly creative and quick. And this is also how many jokes work. We've been hearing lots of jokes. The Smothers Brothers, for example, for those of you who attended that event, a lot of Talmudic logic going on there. So here's one, a joke that works by Talmudic logic. An Irishman walks into a bar. I know you've never heard a joke that begins that way before. And he sits down and he orders 3 pints of Guinness. And he takes a sip from each of the pints of Guinness consecutively until he finishes all 3. And then he goes back to the bar and orders a second round. And the bartender kind of notices this, and the Irishman becomes a regular at the pub. And eventually the bartender says, "Why do you drink like that?" And the Irishman says, "I drink like that to remember my brothers, one of whom moved to America, another moved to Australia, and all 3 of us drink like this to remember the times when we drank together." And the bartender thinks, "Oh, that's sweet. Kind of expensive, but that's sweet." So one night, the Irishman comes into the bar and he orders only 2 pints of Guinness. And a silence falls across the pub. And when he comes up to order the second round, the bartender says, "I'm so sorry for your loss. My condolences." And the Irishman kind of thinks for a minute. He says, "Oh no, my brothers are fine. It's just that I've quit drinking." Again, the logic is impeccable. It may or may not have anything to do with the situation at hand. Okay, so the 5th and final way to be witty is to free associate. We're going to do a little test together, a little word game. This is called the Remote Associates Test, and it was devised in the 60s as a way to measure people's creativity. And the idea being, well, what you have to do is you're given 3 words, and you have to very quickly, as possible, shout out the word that unites them all, that connects them all. Yeah, but wait till I start the game. Jesus. Okay, we're going to try that again. The 5th and final way to be witty is the Remote Associates Test. So, the idea behind the test is that creativity has to do with making novel combinations really quickly from very different things. And so this is one way to measure that. And now we're going to play the game where you get 3 words and you have to find the one that connects them. Cottage, Swiss, cake. Thank you very much. Cheese. Sense, courtesy, place. Common. Very good. Did I say this has to be quick? You're not supposed to... I may have forgot to mention that. You're not supposed to think about it too long. Just shout it out. And the last one, dust, cereal, fish. Bowl. Exactly. Easy. So, again, the idea behind this test is that creativity, and I would argue wit, is the source of creativity, involves finding novel combinations among things. And you can see by how easy it is to do this, that's the way the mind thinks. The mind thinks in patterns. The mind thinks it's a connection-making machine. So here's another way to think about free associating in wit, and this is called multiple object tracking. So it's the same as with the word game, but this we're doing with actual kind of sensory input. And there's 8 or 9 little blue dots on the screen, you'll see. And your job, you'll see that there's 4 dots that have a little white square around them. When they press play back there, all those dots are going to move randomly around the screen. And your job is to keep track of the 4 dots with the white square around them. Any questions so far? So we'll do it, and then we'll see how many dots everybody was able to find. So if we could roll the tape. Well, I can judge by your reaction. You all did very well. Congratulations. So how many people kept track of 4 dots? You, sir. Well done. Anybody 3 dots? One person back there. Another person over there. Anybody, and one person over here. Congratulations. You get your prizes on the way out at the back. 2 dots? Okay, so 1 dot? Yes! Awesome. High-achieving Chautauquans here. So, for the people who got more than 1, I would venture to guess that the way they did that was not by focusing on any individual dot, but by looking at the image as a whole. Because if you focused on any single dot, there's no way you could keep track of the other dots. So, when you're trying to keep many things in mind, the best strategy is to not think about any of them individually, but to think about all of them collectively, and to pay attention to all of them collectively. And that's the way you can keep track of them. This is, in fact, how puns work. I know that's a risky thing. I'm now about to talk about puns. Very divisive subject in these polarized times. So how does a pun work? A pun is 2 words that sound the same but have different meanings. And how do we get and understand puns? It's because our brains are like this multiple object tracking exercise. We've got all the meanings of those words and the sound of those words bouncing around in our heads. And we're instinctively able to make those connections. We don't even have to think about it. If you've seen one shopping center, you've seen them all. Come on, work with me here. I went down to the National Comedy Center yesterday. One of my favorite comedians had an exhibition there, George Carlin. One of his great lines is, "Atheism is a non-profit institution." So sometimes when I talk about wit, I organize pun competitions among the audience. And I ask for volunteers to shout out a subject. And we have a little contest to see who can make puns. And I was doing the talk once in D.C., and I also asked for audience shout-out for suggestions about what to pun about. And someone shouted out from the audience, "The wall." And a silence very much like that one fell across the crowd. And then from the back of the room came a woman's voice, and she said, "Don't take offense." That is an absolutely brilliant pun because it's playing on the sound of words, but it also has a very, very sharp, insightful social meaning. Now, whoever was here for Frank Oz's talk yesterday was making a pun. If you remember, if you were there, he was talking about the scene with Steve Martin when he was in prison and he couldn't remember the guy's name, and he was explaining how to signal to the other actor when to deliver his line. He was lying on the floor, touching his ankle. And he used that example to describe how he directs by feel. And then all you people, dirty-minded people that you are, burst out into laughter because you were interpreting feel in another way. You were making a pun, and you were making a pun. I don't even think Frank intended to make a pun, but you guys did. And that's how instinctive punning is. And why I argue in the book The received wisdom is that punning is the lowest form of wit. But I actually think it's the highest form of wit. All right. And why do I say that? Because I think puns show what the real essence of true wit is. And that is the ability to hold two different ideas about the same thing in your mind at the same time. And that's exactly what all of you were doing when Frank very innocently used the word feel. What I also think is really interesting and unique about puns is that I would argue that the giver, like people think I'm not witty, I can't make puns, I don't know how to tell a joke. But actually, if you think about it, think about puns. The person who makes up a pun and the person who understands a pun are making exactly the same connection. The person who makes the pun is making that connection in one direction, and the person who receives and understands the pun is making that connection in the other direction. But the actual connection is identical. So the person who makes a pun and the person who receives a pun are performing exactly the same creative work, and they are equally witty. So if you understand the pun, if you've seen one shopping center, you've seen a mall, you've made the same connection between shopping center and mall and M-all that I had when I made that pun. We're doing exactly the same work. And this got me thinking about spirituality, got me thinking about humor, got me thinking about wit, and the way that we talk about jokes, and the way that we talk about sermons. Comedians deliver punchlines. Preachers deliver sermons. It's like pizza. You can call up your local preacher and say, can I get an 18-inch deep pan sermon with extra cheese? And she will deliver that for you. But at the same time, we talk about audiences getting a joke, or getting a pun, or getting the point of a sermon. So the pizza analogy kind of reminds me of Yogi Berra. It was a famous incident where he was at a pizza restaurant. The person brought the pizza to his table and said, "Would you like it cut into 8 or 4 slices?" And Yogi Berra, being the wit that he was, he said, 4. I don't think I could eat 8. So you guys just got that joke, and I delivered it. But I didn't explain it to you, and I didn't need to explain it to you. You came out to get it, and I delivered it. But the delivery of jokes, of puns, of wit, of wisdom, it's not door-to-door delivery. You have to come out and meet it. You have to go out and get it. And the comedian or the preacher can only deliver it so far. It requires the audience. It requires the individual to complete it. And the person who makes the joke, the person who makes the pun, and the person who understands the joke, the person who understands the pun, they're accomplices. And one can't do her work without the other. So I think this common meeting place, that's where wit happens. Jokes can be private, but wit needs witnesses. Wit is something that happens between and among people, and it requires equal willingness and equal creativity on both parts to make it work. And I think what's really interesting about wit is that that's where a real meeting of minds takes place. Because when you're understanding a pun or a joke, you have to inhabit the same mental space as the person who made that joke or made that pun. You really get inside someone's head when you share a joke with them, when you share a pun with them. Now, being inside someone else's head can be a very unpleasant place to be. to put it mildly. But I think that's where the real encounter of wit takes place. That's where the real creative friction of making wit and having ideas and being creative, that's where it happens, in that encounter with another mind. So, before the questions, this brings me to my final point about why we need wit. And I think the reason we need wit is because, like I said at the beginning, wit is not just about being funny. It's about making connections, and it's about solving problems. So all of the most serious problems that we face today, they're really, really complex problems. So if you just take the climate crisis, for example, the climate crisis can't be solved by focusing on one thing, because it involves so many things. It involves the environment. It involves economics. It involves human psychology. It involves race relations. It involves international relations. You can't solve a problem like the climate crisis without incorporating and dealing with all those things. So, and that's what wit is. Like juggling, wit is keeping lots of different ideas, lots of different balls in the air at the same time, and keeping them aloft long enough to make that connection that's going to lead to the solution of a problem. So you think of some of the great inventions and great discoveries in history. A lot of them were made serendipitously through wit. Not that Velcro is all that earth-shattering, but Velcro was discovered because someone noticed that a burr, his dog was taking his dog for a walk through the forest, and burr stuck to the coat, the dog's coat, his fur. And he realized, I could use that for other things. Insulin was discovered because in the 19th century, German experimenters were removing the pancreases of dogs to understand how that organ worked. And a lab assistant was just walking through the yard one day, and he noticed that flies were gathered all around the urine of the dogs that had their pancreases removed. And nobody could figure that out. So they tested the urine, and it was filled with sugar. And of course, in diabetes, people who have type 1 diabetes, their pancreas no longer makes insulin. And insulin is the hormone that turns sugar in your body into energy. And so when you don't have any insulin and you can't convert that energy, all the sugar goes into your urine because it's toxic to the body. And the body tries to get rid of it by urinating it out. And that's what these dogs were doing. And this lab assistant noticed that. And that was like a random piece of information. But he was paying attention. And he was paying attention to his full field of vision, like the multiple object tracking. And he noticed this, and he connected with other information that he had. And that's what eventually led to the discovery of insulin. So, I should just say a few words about my book. So, because if you open it, you might want to be a little bit prepared for what's in there. I wrote the book in many different styles because I wanted to talk about wit, but I also wanted to show what wit is. And that's like a really important guiding principle of journalism. When you're a journalism student, the first thing you learn is show, don't tell in your stories. So I wanted to show what wit was like. And so I attempted to do that, but by writing each chapter in a different style. So there's a chapter on the neuroscience of wit, how wit works in the brain, and that's written like a scientific paper. There's a couple chapters on verbal wit, and one of those chapters is written like a scene from a play, like a dramatic dialogue. Another chapter is written like a rap song, which I will not be rapping for you this afternoon, or this morning. You'll be relieved to know. Another chapter is written in jive. There's a chapter written as a retelling of some parables and trickster stories from cultures all around the world. There's a chapter, coincidentally written in the voice of an Irishman at a bar, who's telling jokes and reflecting on the philosophical meaning of jokes. And the last chapter of the book is about the spirituality of wit, and it's written in the form of a sermon. So, I don't think it would be fair to end my talk without also trying to show, during my talk, how wit works, rather than just talk about it. And I can only do that while juggling. And I do need a volunteer from the studio audience. I'm looking at you, sir, who got the four dots. I need you to perform a very important function, if you would not mind just standing up. What is your name? Mike. I just need you to throw this ball to me in a nice, gentle arc like that. And just please wait till I'm ready. Just work with me, Mike, all right? It's a couple more minutes, and then you can go. So just like that, but seriously, you have to wait till I'm ready. Let's see. Okay. I'm ready. All right. So, nice round of applause for Mike. So, wit is never about just one thing. It's always about multiple things, and it's about making patterns and connections between things. And like I said, in our interpersonal relations, in our social relations, all these most serious problems we face as a society, we have to keep our wits about us to solve them. And as we think about these problems and the challenges that face us, we should not be scared out of our wits, but scared into our wits, because it's only by coming out to meet those problems creatively and with our wits that we can solve them. And once we do that, ladies and gentlemen, you will be witty, and you will have taught your mind to do the twist. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you need to leave to get to something else here at Chautauqua, we would ask you to do so quickly and quietly so that those who want to stay for the questions and answers can do so and hear. So James, what, as a journalist for over 20 years, inspires one to write about metaphors and aphorisms and to take on the topic of wit?
So I think there's, since I was a little kid, I shared that story about Reader's Digest. I've always been interested and fascinated by language. And I will confess to you that when I was a younger person, I'm still very interested in poetry, but as a younger person, I was only interested in poetry. And as a recent college graduate, I had vowed to myself that I would never write prose, because prose was just not cool enough. Then I got out of college and I had to earn a living, and I realized one of the few marketable skills that I had was I could actually write a half-decent sentence, and that's how I got into journalism. And I was very fortunate to work for Time magazine as long as I did, because at Time there was a real emphasis on fine writing, so the reporting was important. The facts, of course, were essential. But a lot of the editing that went on in Time really focused on the language and trying to make the language really vital and alive, so that people would enjoy reading it and by enjoying it, remember it better. So in journalism, there's an expression for the last sentence or the last paragraph of a story is the kicker. It's called the kicker. And I remember late nights trying to think of a good kicker for my story, because the kicker is supposed to deliver that final message and bring everything back together again and leave a kind of memorable conclusion for the story. And so as I learned about writing through being a journalist, I also kind of brought in my passion for aphorisms and for poetry and for metaphor, and all these things also are used in journalism. Imagery is used in journalism, metaphor is used in journalism, and the more that we become, as journalists, conscious of the tools that we're using. I mentioned the headlines referring to the debates. Those are metaphors, and I would be willing to bet that the people who wrote those headlines did not consider the metaphors that they were using. And I think part of what journalism needs to do, which is part of the challenge of political polarization that we all face, is be much more conscious of and careful with the kind of language that we use. It's true of news consumers as well as news producers. So that's how those two things intersected. And I think another way that journalism relates to wit has to do with making connections. Because the whole point of journalism is to find out things, often things that people don't want you to find out, and to make connections between those things, and to be able to tell that story that you would never be able to tell without having made those connections. So there's the part of the production of journalism, at least written journalism, which is what I've always done, but also the thinking about what is a story and being able to spot a potential story and finding those hidden connections and bring them together. I think that's how I feel like wit and journalism are connected.
What's the difference between sarcasm and wit?
Sarcasm and wit. So I think wit, I would say this, sarcasm is wit used as a weapon. And like anything else, wit can be used for good ends and it can be used for bad ends. And I think we all know people who are very, very sharp and very, very witty, and they use their wit to hurt or demean other people. Sarcasm. And it's interesting, there's so many of the words that the terms that we use to describe wit come from fencing. So someone has a cutting wit, or a rapier wit, or a witty banter is a sally, and you have a riposte. These are all fencing terms, and also presents wit as a kind of battle, which it can be. And there's a very long tradition in many cultures around the world of witty competitive insults, which are basically sarcastic. And these are like competitions where people are taking part, and you have to insult the other person, and then they insult you, and you just keep going back and forth until you can't think of an insult anymore. For example, one, you're so dumb, it takes you a half... I totally screwed it up. Let me try that again. You're so dumb, you think the Supreme Court is where Diana Ross plays tennis. The other one I was trying to say was, you're so dumb, it takes you an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. So those are kind of lighthearted, sarcastic remarks, but again, sarcasm is a real thing, and wit can be used to hurt people as well as help them.
Do you see wit, this is from Twitter, do you see wit as highly culturally specific or universal?
Yeah, so Twitter is a good example because it's got the word wit in it. It's also got the word twit in it. So I do think wit is universal. It's like, it's just a way that the human mind really works. And those connections and like the ability to make puns and things like that and to understand puns, I don't think that's culturally specific at all. I just think it's an inherent ability of the human mind. But what is culturally specific is and the kinds of connections that people will make. And I think that has a lot to do with, you can connect that back to like proverbs and old sayings from different parts of the world. In Holland, for example, in the Netherlands, there's lots and lots of expressions that have to do with the sea. Like one expression is that doesn't add any sod to the dike. And what that means is it's like carrying coals to Newcastle. It's pointless. It's not effective. One is an English expression because coal was very important to that country's growth, and the other is native to the Netherlands because they were fighting against the sea for their entire history to kind of keep the sea from flooding their country. So their wit is the same, but the connections that they make, I think, depend on your cultural circumstances. So references to sod on a dike don't make a lot of sense in America, perhaps, but it does in the Netherlands. So, but the making of those comparisons and the making of those connections is the same. It's just the reference points that are culturally specific.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. Please join me in thanking Jim Geary for today's presentation.